Hey guys, welcome back to Mo's Game Table. Today we're going to talk about Freezing Inferno. This is a game from Princeps Games, and it is going on Kickstarter this week. I've already done a prototype preview of this game for you, and now we're going to talk about the actual gameplay. I finished another game last night, and now I wanted to set up another one for today. And before I get started, I wanted to shoot the preview here for the Kickstarter, and I wanted you to see the setup here, the overall setup, because this is going to play into some of the comments that I'm going to make about the game itself. Now, those of you who've seen the preview already know about my issues with the map. We're going to hit on that. We're also going to hit on the fonts that we talked about here, about these player aid cards. The fonts are just not very readable in my opinion. Well, when I did that video and I talked about the fonts not being readable, I also talked about the map being cartoonish and just not really fitting a war game, in my opinion. Princeps heard that and listened to it and took it to heart. They didn't hesitate to reach out and get in touch with me and discuss my concerns about the map as well as the fonts. As a matter of fact, they said the fonts are going to get changed for sure. That was just immediate. That is, they agree with my point that the fonts just need to be changed. So that's a great step right there. The map also, they listened to the concerns and they went ahead and they started work on getting a new map done. And I've spoken with Vukasin here from Princeps extensively about the map, and they've really reworked the map to the point where it's going to be a lot better looking than this map is. As you can see here on screen, it's much more fitting of what we expect in a war game, and I really think they've done a great job with updating the map and taking all of the concerns into account. They've named the cities as well as changing up the way the lakes look across the map and the trees, which that was one of the big things right away. Is you look at these trees, and while they are really nice looking, it's attractive art, don't get me wrong, it just doesn't seem to fit for a war game. So now they've got proper forests out there, and it's going to look a lot better. Now, they're proud of this map, so they're going to keep this art. They're just going to also allow those of us who want the other map to use that by having it on the opposite side. So you're going to have the best of both worlds. If you like this map, you can use this map. If you like the other more wargaming style map, you can use the other side of the map. So it's a great compromise and a great way of pleasing the two audiences that Princeps is trying to attract, which is the war gamers as well as the casual hobby gamers that are curious about war games. That's what they're trying to do here, is get that crossover appeal. So the way the game works, very simple. The Soviets are on their side of the border. The Finns are on their side of the border here. And you're going to invade Finland. The Soviets want to take 2 of the 3 key cities that are the ones with the stars on it by the end of turn 8, while at the same time maintaining 5 of their 7 cities on their side of the border. The Finns want to delay that as long as possible and try to take 3 cities if they can from the Soviets, or just deny 2 of the 3 cities here for the Soviets before the end of turn 8. So that's going to happen basically in a series of delaying actions. That's all you're going to do, is you're going to keep collapsing back, but you're going to try to delay the Soviets as long as possible. Tie them up where you can, slow them down, and then defend. You just choose which 2 cities you want to defend and defend the hell out of them to make sure the Soviets cannot get those cities. Like I said, this is an 8-turn game. There is no turn track. The turn track is handled by cards. You're going to have 8 different cards that you're going to pull, 1 for each turn, and it's going to give you what effect will be used for that turn. So at the beginning of the turn, you grab a card, you flip it over, and at the top here, you've got a little bit of history. Then at the bottom, it's going to tell you what's going to happen this turn. The attack modifier +1 for Soviet air units when attacking the city hex. So on the opener, the Soviets are going to get a +1 for the air attacks on cities. So this way they can kind of go in there and get that first wave through and try to hit pretty hard. These cards are not going to be the same every time. There are 3 different cards for each turn. You just randomly draw one, you build your 8-card deck, and you go from there. And you'll see there are going to be different things that are going to happen each turn. For turn 2, Soviet headquarters area of supply is reduced to 6 hexes, which we're going to talk about that when we get into the units, because the headquarters are actually 7 units. Now we've got turn 3, for example, we've got movement of the Soviet land units through the enemy's cost is +1. Players reinforce their units. Now is when reinforcements can come in, as in turn 3, and we'll get into that too when we talk about your military capacity as well as your units. But we're just looking through these cards here real quick. Terrain modifier, forest hex costs 3 movement points instead of 4. for Finnish infantry. So the Finns are going to get an advantage, being it's their home country. They know the terrain. They can move more quickly and easily through the forests. Air units cannot attack. Only airlifts are allowed. That's in turn 5. So air units are not able to attack, but you can still do your airlifts. Players will reinforce their units again. Then we get turn 6. No bonus from fortifications. So those fortifications have taken a hammering here for 6 turns. They're not really worth anything anymore. They have no bonus. Finnish tank movements are reduced by 2 movement points. The players reinforce their units in turn 7. And then in the final turn, Finland receives 5 MC. The players reinforce their units. The MC is your military capacity. That's your currency in the game. That's what you're going to use to pay for units and stuff like that, which we're going to talk about here in a moment. Next thing I want to look at are the units that come with the game. I'm doing a side-by-side for a couple of reasons here. There are some pros and cons I find with the unit counters. First off, a major pro for these counters is that they are very well done. Each unit has an individual image, which is easy to understand and differentiate from. At a glance, you can tell what unit's out there on the map, and you can also tell the strength of the unit, which we're going to talk about here, that I see as both a pro and con. Now, not only are the units very easily discernible by type, the unit information is also very clean on the counter. The attack value is at the top left. The defense value is across from that on the top right. The movement value is on the bottom left. These 2 units here are leaders, and they only have defensive values, the number 6 at the top. They have movement values at the bottom left. Leaders are critical for your supply, which has a range of 7 hexes. Units must remain in that command range to stay in supply. Anything beyond that is going to be out of supply, and that includes being isolated or interrupted by enemy Zocs. For the artillery and the anti-aircraft, you've got that 4H for both of those, and that is the hex range that they can attack from. So both of these can attack from 4 hexes. For the anti-aircraft, they do not have an attack value. They just say less than 3, which means you need to roll a 1 or 2 to hit, which is why the less than symbol is next to the 3 there, so it makes it easier to tell that you need a 1 or 2 to hit. Pretty easy to follow. We have 2 different types of aircraft in the game. We have fighters and we have bombers. And you can see the movement for the fighters is 14 hexes and it is 17 hexes for the bombers. Their movement is just in hexes because they're not going to be affected by terrain in any of their movement. This hex movement is their overall range, not just a one-way range, but an overall range. This is the maximum amount of travel both to the target and then back to an airfield, any airfield controlled by that player. If you cannot fly to your intended target and then land safely back at a controlled airfield, the mission can't take off. The rules explicitly state that no suicide missions can take place, so we're not going to see any kamikaze attacks here in the Winter War. Now here's where I'm going to hit on one of the cons of the counters. You're going to notice, if you haven't already, that these counters are identical on both sides. So neither side has an advantage in technology over the other. You're going to have identical units on both sides. Nothing makes these units unique. Now, this can be modified somewhat with the additional modules, which we'll talk about, where you can add in advanced technologies that you can pursue on your own. And this will give the units unique personality, but out of the box, they're identical. So the setups are going to be pretty much identical as well, which we'll talk about when we get back to the map and we'll take a look at that. But you can see not only are these units identical, but there are no unit designators either. So you don't have to worry about unit cohesion and keeping units together, which is both a pro and con, because it's great in that you don't have to worry about matching up units to each other and looking at unit IDs or unit ID bands, things like that. But for those who want to have a little more historicity, you're going to say, hey, these don't have unit designators. That's kind of a negative. I see it as a positive because one of the other things you can do is you can take from one unit and give to another that's nearby if you want to change your strength up. So you can chop some of your units off to another unit to give them a little bit more strength, which we'll cover a little bit more when we get into the combat. Now, to go back to the counters for a second, I want to talk about the aircraft. Remember I said they have 14 or 17 hex movement for the fighters and bombers respectively. They need to get back to an airfield that you control. Obviously for the Finns here, and then for the Soviets there, although the Soviets, when they get across the line, they're going to want to take some airfields here, and that would be an airfield they can go back to. You see here there are multiple hexes for each airfield. We have a 3-hex airfield, a 2-hex airfield. Right here, another 2-hex airfield, and a 3-hex to the right. To control the airfield, you must take the control tower that is at the airfield. Can't just have control of one of the hexes that the airfield consists of. take over the control tower, and you will deny opponent aircraft from landing at that airfield. That's why it's imperative for the Soviets early on to take those airfields that are closest to the Soviet border to impede some of those air missions and the air mission reach for the Finns. If they can, at the same time, that opens up the air bridge for the Soviet bombers to ferry in follow-on forces. And one of the things about having the bombers used for follow-on forces is you can't use the bombers for attacks, but you can ferry your units in. That's one of those give and take things about that. But it's really important to get those units across the border quick. So the deeper into the Finnish territory you can get a airfield, the deeper you can get units quickly. So when it comes to setup, you have your basic and your advanced setup. Your basic setup is going to be identical on both sides, and the advanced is going to be identical as well as far as strength. But we're going to kind of touch on that here in a minute. But the basics here are going to be identical. The only difference is Soviets get one extra tank, a fighter, and a bomber unit. Other than that, they're identical. Now, the advanced setup, you're going to be taking strength points, not just having your full units out there, but you're going to be taking strength points, and you can split them up however you want, like I've done kind of with the Finns here. The Soviets have left them at full strength, and they're just going to march across the board in just full strength. The Finns, you want to split up a little more and get some of these weaker units out there. Like I've got the infantry here, a 3, and then I got a 2 and a 2, another 3 back here. You want to have just smaller units out there for the Finns. Effectively, they're just going to be speed bumps. You want to tie up the Soviet forces as they're coming across that border and force them to engage. And maybe with the terrain and the right die rolls, you can slow them down and force another unit to engage you because that first unit was not able to destroy you. It's all about delay tactics for the Finns. You're trying to wait them out those 8 turns. So you want to slow them down, delay, and then retreat a little bit, give up a little bit of ground, utilizing that terrain if you have to. But you want to make sure you slow that Soviet advance and tie them up as much as you can, because everything for the Finns is defense. But appropriately timed counteroffensives can also be beneficial as well, because if you can find an opening for a nice counter thrust, you can open up a seam in the Soviet line. If you can do that, then you can get behind their lines and take a city. And if you can take a city, you can maybe get enough forces across the line. Maybe you can split off and take 2 cities, because the Soviets, most of the time, are going to just want to push across as hard as they can, use that blitzkrieg-style tactics that they saw the Germans have success with in Poland. So they're going to want to push across the same way. If you can find a seam and shoot across where you go, they have to stop and go, whoa, hold on. We got to peel off some units and protect our cities because we just lost 1 or 2 of our cities. We lose 3, it's game over, man. So we want to make sure we don't give up that 3rd city and go back and protect that area right there. But at the same time, for the Finns, it's a gambit, because if you risk that and you run your units over there, you're thinning out your forces here. So again, it's one of those things where you got to time it right, you got to find the right opportunity and make that counterattack count. Now, one of the other things that we can do in this game is they have this setup sheet, which I showed you in the prototype preview. Both sides are supposed to secretly write down where their units are going to set up. So like if you have infantry, you put an I and then the strength next to it. If it's a full strength unit, it'll be an I5, an I2, or whatever. You write these up in secret, and then you will then put them down on the map, and you'll start laying out your units at the same time. So that way neither side can adjust. Now, I think it's a cool thing, and for the introductory type of game this is, it's fitting. It's not historically accurate, but it does give both players full agency to decide how they want to set things up. I would like to see some sort of historical order of battle, and they're talking about doing something like that for this game, and I hope they do that for the Kickstarter, because that's something that really should be here, because I think it really will appeal more to wargamers having more historical order of battle, and this is such a really interesting battle that I think it really should be shown. So when you're writing this up or you're laying your units out there, one of the key things for the Finns is to make sure that you stay outside of 4 hexes from that border, because remember, we talked about the artillery before. They have a 4 hex reach. You want to make sure that they don't get to hammer you on that opening salvo here before they even kick off and move the main body across the LOD. You don't want to have your units out there getting hammered and weakening those lines. So make sure that you've got your units at least 5 hexes back and in terrain as best as possible to help protect them, because you will get modifiers for that. So that's one of the things to keep in mind when you're setting up your Finnish units. Now, I'm hoping that they do follow up with doing an order of battle of this, because this is such an interesting conflict that is really not as widely covered as it could be. And I think it's something that a lot of people don't appreciate. I understand they want to make the game as balanced and appealing for the crossover gamers, that crossover audience that they're shooting for, which is primarily going to be attracting in hobby gamers to try out war games, whereas war gamers will play any war game for the most part, unless it just seems too simple. Now, this is simple, but it's not too simple. It's got some layers to it, and it's got enough meat to be interesting for experienced war gamers. But one of the things that I'd like to see covered, like I said, with the order of battles, is the reality of this battle was that there was a gross imbalance between the Soviet forces and the Finnish forces. It was just ridiculous. They dwarfed the Finnish in pretty much every aspect. When it comes down to it, they had the infantry was, I think, double what the Finns had. And when it came to armor, it was ridiculous. The Finns had a few dozen tanks. The Soviets had thousands. So when it comes down to that, you want to see that reflected in an order of battle, whereas this is going to be a balanced game. So, and I'm not knocking the game. I know what they're going for, and I agree with it. But that's why I'd like to see a historical order of battle added into the game to reflect that historicity for the hardcore war gamers. Now, for the crossover gamers, just getting them to play a war game is cool, and that's fine, and that's great. But I'd like to see more of the historicity reflected, because this is just such a one-sided battle on paper that didn't turn out that way, that I'd like to see it reflected in the OOBs. Now, one of the things about doing that with the OOB is that it might require additional development of new rules and capabilities to reflect both the tenacity of the Finnish forces as well as their guerrilla tactics, so along with weather and terrain. So that's something that could possibly delay things, but at the same time, I would think that they can still get the game out. And once the game's out, they can still continue to develop those and then release those at a future time. Because if you're not going to add any new counters to the game, things like that, it's very easy just to release a PDF of rules with the order of battle and any additional new rules for like a advanced or hardcore game. They can just do that on their website, and I hope they do. Now, we've got this track on the side here. This is the military capacity. This is essentially your currency in the game. The Soviets start with 29, the Finns start with 28, and as you lose a city, you lose that many points. The other side that takes that city only gains 1. Now, the Finns, the majority of their cities are 1. Their key cities are 3, so that's where they're going to lose the most. The Soviets, on the other hand, their cities are 5, 4, 5, 3, 4, 3, and 5. So if you as the Finns can get in there and take one of those 5-strength cities, you're only going to get 1 point for taking that. But the Soviets are going to lose 5, and that's really painful. If you can hit a 5 and a 3, a 5 and a 4, if you get one after the other up in either corner, down at the S-Mister down on the top northeastern side, that's going to be painful for the Soviets. So you want to, as the Soviets, make sure they don't do that. But as the Finns, you want to get in there and hurt the Soviets, because that will lessen their capability to rebuild units, to get reinforcements, things like that. Whereas the Finns you can lose 1 or 2 cities, or even 3 or 4 cities, because then you're losing at maximum 3 or 4 points. Whereas the Soviets could lose 3 points with taking 1 city, up to 5. So that's where that is very critical to protect for the Soviets and critical to take for the Finns. Now we're going to take a quick look at combat, and it is very straightforward, very easy to understand. Remember that attack value that we looked at before when we were looking at the counters at the top left and then the defense value on the top right? Well, both of those get added to the strength value of your stack, which is the number of units in your stack. For the Soviets here, they've got an attack value of 5 and they've got a strength value of 4, so their total attack strength is going to be 9. Here for the Finns, you've got a defense strength of 4 and a stack strength of 3, so their total defense strength is going to be 7. All you got to do at that point is pull up your, let's see if I can get this on top of that without knocking over the counters. You look for 9 to 7 right here. It's 121, 141%, or 140%. 9 to 7, you do your roll, and then it'll give you your result here. Very straightforward, very easy. You don't have to do any math in your head as far as figuring out the different ratios. It's all done for you on the CRT. And with that CRT, we've got a couple of different dice options here. You've got your D8, which is what you're going to use to determine the outcome of the combat. You roll that, you get your number. Or you can use these special D20s, and they're weighted in different ways. Under adjusting luck, it says, in order to adjust the impact of luck on the game, you can choose to use the 3 different types of dice. You've got your standard D8, where you've got a 12.5% chance of getting any number from 1 to 8. Then you can use either of the custom D20, where you have a 10% chance of getting a 1, 2, 7, or 8, but a 15% chance of getting a 3, 4, 5, or 6. The other custom D20 gives you a 5% chance of getting a 1 or 8, a 10% chance of getting a 2 or 7, and a 15% chance of getting a 3 or 6, and a 20% chance of getting a 4 or 5. So I like that they're looking at other ways of adjusting the outcome of combat by not just adding in a whole bunch of modifiers and stuff, by using weighted dice. Now, like I said, the combat's very straightforward. You basically just add up your attack and defense strengths. You find your ratio. I didn't mention, which is just common sense, but I forget. Not everybody here is a wargamer that's watching this. They may be newer hobby gamers that are not familiar with war games, but you will also take into account your terrain modifiers and things like that, other DRMs that will affect the roll that you get on top of the type of weighted dice that you use or the regular standard D8. So those are things to take into account when you're playing a game. If you don't like the way things are rolling, then you can roll with a certain dice. It's also a great way to handicap if you're playing against somebody. You say, you know what, I'm going to roll the standard D8, or I'm going to roll this one that's tougher to get certain rolls. So it's a nice little way that Princeps has adjusted things, and I like that addition to the game. And for the last thing that I haven't touched on yet is these cards, these additional cards that you've got. You got 3 different modules that you can add in. They're optional. You don't have to use them, but you can add in either one or all of them that you choose. You can add in weather, you can add in technologies, and then you can also add in diplomacy. When it comes to weather, it's really simple. You get your die roll and it'll tell you the temperature as well as the weather conditions, and they will have different effects on the game. Then technologies. Each side will have different technologies that they can do to affect weapons platforms or give you benefits for infantry, armor, artillery, things like that. Then you have your meteorology, espionage, and sabotage. Meteorology allows you to see the weather conditions for the next round. Espionage, you can reroll either your or your opponent's die if you're not satisfied with the result. And then sabotage is enemy unit with the sabotage marker under it can't play on their next turn. So those are ways that you can affect the game. Not hard additions to the game, but they do add additional layers and choices on how you want to spend your MCs, your military capacity, because remember, that's the currency you're going to use in the game. I like that you have those as optional layers, because if you just want to introduce somebody who's not familiar with war games, you just go with the straight basic game and you play and you're done. They like it, you come back and you say, hey, let's go with the advanced setup this time, and we're going to, split some units up for the Finns if they like playing the Finnish side. Let them split units up and let them experience making those decisions. At the same time, maybe you introduce weather and just one thing, or maybe technology. Maybe they like the idea of doing technology research. They're a hobby gamer. They're familiar with that tech tree that you see in a lot of Euro games, where you want to spend your points to advance different aspects to give you boons when it comes to offense and defense. So that's something that would also be easy to introduce for a hobby gamer, I think, if you're a war gamer trying to get a friend of yours into wargaming. All right, so final thoughts on the game. I think this is a very easy game to understand. It's not going to be difficult to understand at all, but it still has enough meat to be interesting for experienced wargamers. For new wargamers, or those curious about checking out a war game, the hobby gamers that want to check out a war game, this is not going to be hard for you to grok. It's only got about, I think, 8 pages of actual rules. So I think it's like 18 pages of the rule book. But when you take out all of the extra stuff, the background information and the optional modules and all, I think it's about 8 pages of rules. So it's not a lot of rules to understand. The combat's very straightforward. For new wargamers, the DRM stuff may throw you off a little bit, but it's really not hard to understand. You basically just see what your odds are against each other, what your ratio is, and they've made it very simple with this CRT that breaks down all the ratios for you. You don't have to do any math, and you basically just compare those, add in any of your modifiers for terrain, things like that, or anything you get off the cards or off your technologies. Then you come to your conclusion, you roll that dice, and you find out what the outcome is. So very easy to understand. Where it gets a little more meaty is when you get into the advanced setup and you can split up your units. And then you can also add in your technologies and diplomacy and the weather. That's where it starts getting a little more meaty. And I think for a hobby gamer, it might take you a game or two to get that under your belt before you actually get into those aspects. And then you feel comfortable. Then you can jump in and it's not going to be difficult at all. For an experienced wargamer, you're going to probably want to do the whole thing right away and have a lot of fun with it. A couple things that didn't touch on that I should have, I forgot to mention, was about these stacks. Remember, I said there's no unit designations, and you don't, which is good, because that way you don't have to worry about, oh, this is the 21st armor, they got to be with the 21st armor, or matching up unit bands, things like that. No, you just put tanks on top of tanks, infantry on top of infantry, and you move on. That's great for ease of use. It's not great if you want to have a little more accuracy by having certain units out there in the field, but it's not a big deal at all. Where it's really cool is when you're out there, if you want to move units around a little bit, say you've got a big push of Soviets coming here and you've got a few Finnish units here, a couple of infantry, an armor unit, and artillery. Well, this armor unit that's up there, the infantry unit that's up there, they've only got 2 units and you've got 5 back here. You can just chop a couple of your units. You can take 3 units and put them up there and give it a full, make it a full strength unit by just moving some units over. So I think that is pretty cool, because that allows a lot of latitude and a lot of agency for the players in how they set up and move their units. And it's not a foregone conclusion. You may want to sucker in the Soviets. Hey, come through this gap here. I want you to come get me, because this is a juicy target. It's only 2 strength infantry and you got a key city here. Well, then you run these other guys up here so they're close enough, then they throw over some of the unit strength to help that unit. That slows them down. They may get through them, but then they've got you. You're a weaker unit. Well, you get another unit up here. And then again, you feed that unit. You make sure that you've got a stronger unit. So that's another way that you can have some delaying tactics, and in a sneaky sort of way, in a way. You're drawing the Soviets in, and then you're kind of slapping them down with units that they didn't expect to be as strong as they once were. So that's kind of neat. I like that flexibility there. And like I said, going with miniatures instead of counters, I hope they do go that miniature route. When you set up Finnish players, make sure you get that 4 hex buffer zone for the artillery. You don't want to just throw away units right off the get-go. So make sure you have that 4 unit buffer. Another thing, there's a solo bot, and the solo bot is very easy to follow, and it flows logically. So there's no trying to figure out what this flowchart means or any of these things, having to make big decisions. It's pretty straightforward, it's pretty easy, and I think it's going to work pretty good. And then the last thing here for the Soviets, pretty much bull in a china shop. Just run across as hard as you can, push the Finns back as hard as you can, take as many cities as quickly as you can, and try to hurt them, take away the MCs, although they're not going to hurt as much as you will if you lose yours, and then you gain some, which allows you to bring in more reinforcements and gives you more capability or more currency to rebuild and reinforce units. For the Finns, defense in depth, delaying, that's what you want to do. You want to hold them out as much as you can, give a hex or 2, hold the line, give a hex or 2, and then just try to delay them as much as you can. 8 turns is what you got to survive. Find your choke points and hold them down there. When you can, counterattack. Find a seam. Get in there. Take a city, because now that's going to hurt the Soviets more than you. Losing cities is going to hurt you. Remember, when they lose a city, they lose the MCs. You do too, but your cities are all 1 point. The Soviets, it's 3, 4, 5. So it's going to be expensive for them. You're still only going to gain 1 point. So it's not going to be a benefit to you in that regard, but it's going to be a benefit by taking away from the Soviets. So that's where you've got that pretty cool difference between the Finns and the Soviets. One other thing I didn't mention that I think is really cool is for the Finnish infantry. You can actually destroy a tank, and if you do, you take the tank. You take it over, which I think is pretty cool. And I think this is one of the most interesting and clever aspects of the game, that the infantry can capture the tank if it destroys it. This is a pretty neat way of reflecting the Battle of Suomussalmi, where the Finns captured an embarrassing number of armor, artillery, rifles, ammo, and even trucks and horses. So it's a really neat way of capturing the historicity without overburdening the player with extra rules and things like that. So if you see, as a wargamer, you see, infantry can capture tanks, and you just kind of shrug it off, well, it is reflective of the Battle of Suomussalmi in the Winter War. It's just done in a simple way, which is the point of the game, is to be crossover, have crossover appeal. The way to do that is by simplifying it. So I think that's pretty cool. So overall, I think this is an interesting game. If you are looking for a crossover style war game, an easy war game to play solitaire or with your friends, especially if you got friends that are curious about playing war games and don't want to, they feel intimidated by them, this is a great way to get them into playing a war game. You got kids, great way to introduce them to a war game is by playing this, and especially if they go with the miniatures, that's going to be very attractive and very appealing to everybody. This comes out on Kickstarter this week. Make sure you check it out. When I get a copy of the link, I will paste it in the video below. Well, I hope that helps you guys out if you're curious about this one. If you have any comments or questions, post them down below. Thanks for tuning in, guys. See you next time.